Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here today with Jeff Sebo, who is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies, Affiliated Professor of Bioethics, Medical Ethics, Philosophy, and Law, Director of the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, Director of the Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy, and Co-Director of the Wild Animal Welfare Program at NYU. His research focuses on animal minds, ethics, and policy. AI, Minds, Ethics, and Policy, and Global Health and Climate Ethics and Policy. He's the author of The Moral Circle and Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, and co-author of Chimpanzee Rights and Food, Animals and the Environment. He's also on the advisory board member at the Jeremy Collar Center for Animal Sentience, an advisory board member at the Insect Welfare Research Society, and an advisor at Elios AI, and a senior affiliate at the Institute for Law and AI. In 2024, Vox included him on its Future Perfect 50 list of thinkers, innovators, and changemakers who are working to make the future a better place. Professor Sebo, thanks for making time to talk with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So you've been dealing with issues that are of great importance to me and our community. And just to start with a big but basic question around suffering.
Mm.
Where does your moral concern for suffering come from for you?
My concern, to some extent, is intuitive and to some extent was informed by academic philosophy because it is common now in ethics for people to regard sentience, the capacity to suffer, as, if not necessary, then at least sufficient for welfare and moral considerability. Because when you have conscious experiences that can feel good or bad to you, when you can experience pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering, then you have a stake in what happens to you. It matters to you what happens to you. And at that point, once you have a stake, once it matters to you, I think that I have a responsibility to, at the very least, consider your interests when making decisions that affect you, and at the very least, to avoid causing you pain and suffering and other distressing states unnecessarily.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And yet it seems to be really difficult to care. I mean, whether it was
Mhm.
David Hume or someone else, I mean, the point has been made so many times that we care more about the stubbing of our own toe than the death of a person on the other side of the world. This is a timeless problem of how we actually care. Do you think we care more or less right now than historically? Do you think this is just part of the human condition?
Good question. I do think that being partly altruistic and partly self-interested is a pretty universal trait of humans. Now, obviously, everybody is built a little bit different, and some of us might have a slightly greater share of altruism, others of us might have a slightly greater share of self-interest. Generally speaking, by and large, I think we all have some combination of the two. But your question is whether our altruism might come out more in some eras than in other eras, and if it might be coming out a little bit less right now. And I think that can be true because structural conditions can affect how much we allow our altruism to come out and program our behavior. For example, we do tend to feel a little bit more able to be altruistic in times of abundance than in times of scarcity. We also are able to be a little bit more altruistic just generally when social, legal, political, economic, infrastructural, technological circumstances allow. So, for example, when we feel that we need to use animals for food or medicine, it becomes a little bit harder to empathize with them. It becomes a little bit more tempting to see them as resources, objects, commodities. But when we do have alternatives available to us, alternative sources of food or medicine or other ways of meeting vital needs, then we once again have a little bit more space for viewing animals as subjects who deserve respect and compassion.
Mm, very well said. So, most Americans, certainly not all, but most Americans are going to be concerned about dogs, maybe cats, maybe horses. A much smaller sliver are going to be concerned about farm animals, chickens, cows, pigs. But then, if we keep going out of concern, given the deep uncertainty around insect
Mhm,
sentience,
mhm.
how should moral agents weigh the risk of causing vast but low probability suffering against more certain harms to clearly sentient beings?
This is such a great and complicated question. And I think the way you frame it is perfect because traditionally there has been this presumption that we should extend moral consideration to someone only when we have proof or certainty that they have sentience and can suffer. But that is generally not how we navigate risks in other contexts. In other contexts, we naturally appreciate that if I am certain that a harm will occur, then certainly I should work to prevent it. But even if I am not certain, but know that there is a realistic possibility that a harm will occur, then I should still take reasonable, proportionate steps to mitigate risk. And I think that we ought to take that same approach here. We should not wait for proof or certainty that animals can suffer before taking basic steps to reduce and repair harms that we might be causing them. Once we have enough evidence to indicate at least a realistic possibility that they can suffer, we should once again take reasonable, proportionate steps to mitigate risk. And when the probability is lower, maybe lesser steps are called for, but there should still be some baseline consideration. There should still be some baseline mitigation of harm. And so you now ask what to do when there is a low but non-negligible probability of harm for this really large number of individual insects. And I think we really ought to take seriously the possibility that in the aggregate our responsibilities to them are still quite significant. Even if there is only, say, a 1% chance that an individual ant can suffer, and even if they can only suffer a tiny amount, if at all, okay, that might be a very low amount of expected suffering for the individual ant. But multiplied across the quadrillions of ants who exist at any given time and taking into account the scale of our interactions with them and impacts on them, that really still adds up and deserves serious consideration, even if intuitively, psychologically, it might be difficult for us to appreciate it and naturally empathize with it.
That's really powerful. And just to step back to a moral philosophy question for a moment, I suspect we're mostly using a utilitarian framework, but are you at all concerned with virtue ethics? Like, is the question at all, can we be cruel to robots relevant to you? And, if we were certain that ants don't suffer, should we not inflict pain simply for our own character? Or are you not concerned with that question?
Oh, absolutely. I am concerned with those situations, with those considerations. I do not think that this is strictly a utilitarian analysis. Obviously, when we talk about welfare impacts and when we talk about estimating and quantifying welfare impacts, that does call to mind utilitarian philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And I think that kind of utilitarian thinking does deserve a place in our moral frameworks because whether our actions or practices or policies cause happiness versus suffering to other beings, that ought to be a factor in our decision making. And greater amounts of happiness ought to be treated as better, greater amounts of suffering ought to be treated as worse. But as your question suggests, in order for our moral decision making to be complete, we also ought to complement that utilitarian thinking with other rights oriented thinking, virtue oriented thinking, relational thinking. And you specifically asked about virtue, which is a great opportunity to note that, yes, cultivating virtuous character traits, virtuous ways of naturally seeing and interacting with other animals, that can be a really good complement to those rare moments when we can use our rational, logical thinking in order to inform our decisions. And even if we were certain that these non humans are not sentient, if our interactions with them still shape our character, that can still be a good reason to practice at being kind, since that kindness can then spill over into our interactions with other individuals who are sentient and deserving of that kindness.
Very nice, very nice. So if we accept even a small chance that insects are sentient, does that push us toward radically different policies, such as rethinking pest control, agriculture, urban planning, or are these principles limited to how far precaution should go?
Yes, I do think that they should inform our practices, policies, priorities at a large scale. Right now, we are increasingly using insects in farming. We currently farm more than 1 trillion insects per year, often for human consumption, but even more so for consumption by other animals or even for waste management. That number could be much higher, as high as 50 trillion by the end of the decade. And again, even if the risks or harms to individual black soldier fly larvae are quite small, when multiplied across a trillion individuals at present, tens of trillions in the future, that is still weighty enough to deserve consideration. And we might ask ourselves whether there are alternative ways of producing food or managing waste that would not be imposing these risks on these individuals. Similarly, with pest control, now I am not under the illusion that there will always be happy, positive sum co-beneficial solutions. There will sometimes be intractable interspecies conflict between humans and insects. There will sometimes be a need for self-defense, other defense, the use of lethal measures. But we can, at the very least, treat that as a last resort rather than a first resort. We can search for structural solutions like better infrastructure to minimize conflicts between humans and insects. And we can develop better, less painful insecticides for when lethal measures are necessary, or population control measures for when that sort of control is necessary. And so I see agriculture, infrastructure, research and development of better ways of controlling insect populations. I see those all as viable solutions
Mm,
that would be compatible with our health and well-being, and at the very least, slightly better for their health and well-being.
yeah. By the way, on the dietary front, as someone myself who keeps both kosher and is vegan, people often ask me where do those two not overlap? Where
Mm,
would something totally vegan not be kosher? And my most common answer is that most vegan consumers are not interested or aware in the fact that many dyes come from bugs.
mhm.
So if somebody went to an entirely vegan restaurant, they would know there's no meat. They would know there's no dairy. There would probably be no honey, or eggs. But nobody would ask almost nobody would ask the question, did you make sure that the coloring in dyes didn't come from bugs? So I think that's an interesting aspect of the dietary front where it intersects here. But just to move to my last question, um,
Mhm.
did you ever see the movie like 30 years ago, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids?
Yeah, I did see that 30 years
S-
ago, so I
Yes.
remember very little of it, but yes.
So there's a scene where the humans are all very small, and there's like a big bee or a spider or something, and these bugs are much bigger than us. And so I wonder,
Mhm.
like, do you think our intuitions about bug sentience are distorted by factors like size, evolutionary distance, or aesthetic bias? And if so, like, how can moral philosophy help correct for some of these distortions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned before some of the structural conditions that can bias us and reduce our empathy, and that includes: are we in a time of scarcity instead of abundance, and are we reliant on exploitation of these individuals for our livelihoods, our survival? That can reduce our empathy. But as you suggest, physical features can reduce our empathy too. We do tend to empathize. We are hardwired to empathize more with beings who look and act like us, and so that includes beings with large bodies, large heads, large eyes, symmetrical features, furry skin instead of scaly skin, 4 limbs instead of 6 or 8 limbs, and just general forms of interaction that resemble ours. And insects have the misfortune of not really ticking any of those boxes, except for perhaps certain select charismatic insects we happen to find beautiful, like butterflies or ladybugs, and then we might be able to summon a little bit more concern for them. Though even in those cases, we have concern for them more as objects of beauty than as subjects of painful and pleasurable experiences. So I think philosophy can and science can be a useful form of pushback against those natural biases and intuitions we have, because we can use philosophy and science to actually study the evidence and to appreciate, oh, even if they have smaller bodies, heads, eyes, asymmetrical features in various senses, scaly skin, 6 or 8 legs, they still have the capacity for perception and attention and learning and memory, and they still can engage in flexible decision making and social interactions of various kinds. And that gives us a little window into the kind of life that they might have that matters to them, even if we might not be able to naturally tune into it in the same kind of way that we can do with our cats and dogs. And then I think those types of structural changes that I was suggesting, if we change our food system, if we change our infrastructure, if we come up with better forms of insecticides, then that can be a kind of non-philosophical, non-scientific way of nudging ourselves in the direction of more empathy too, because we can create those structural conditions that allow us to naturally in everyday life live up to those truths that we sense when we take the time to engage with philosophy and science.
Mm, very powerful. You know, on a personal front, I'll say that although I'll confess that my own kind of thinking didn't lead me to this concern on the philosophy side, on theologically it did. And when I looked into my own tradition and I saw that the panentheists, the mystics, the Kabbalists in Sfat, hundreds of years ago, who were willing to get bitten by bugs because they thought there was holy sparks of holiness to all life,
Mm,
and their sense that that they weren't willing to kill the insects that were even bothering them. That really opened my heart on this issue.
mm,
You know, and the last thing I'll leave our listeners with today is if you're not thinking about philosophy, if you're not engaged in activism or policy, something, a really practical thing I would say, and I don't know if you have a practical thing as well, is
mhm,
maybe 10 years ago, I bought a vacuum. You can buy these bug vacuums online for like 15 or 20 bucks. And what it does is, if it's not a super fast flying fly or the like, you can suck it up without hurting it, and it stays in this little vacuum, and then you can take it outside and release it. And
mm.
it's a really easy way to remove things you don't want in your home, but also without hurting it. And I wonder, I don't know if you have any small practical things as well.
That is really really nice. I always do try to remove bugs where possible instead of again killing them as a first resort. Though I have always taken the cup with a sheet of paper approach, and if the vacuum is sufficiently non harmful, then that does seem a little bit easier and a little bit better. I guess one other practical suggestion I would make, and this is less a way of interacting with them and more a way of thinking and talking about them. It does, I think, slightly color our perception of them that we use object pronouns like it instead of subject
Mm,
pronouns like he or she or they when we talk about individual insects. This tends to be a way of demarcating who is seen as a subject versus what is seen as an object in our minds. And so when I talk about individual animals who either are or may be sentient and morally significant, I default to using he, she, or they pronouns to describe them just as a way of subtly reinforcing for myself and others that this entity either is or may be a subject with their own thoughts and feelings and personality and not just an object for us to treat like a table or a chair or other objects in our physical environment. Now that is a kind of psychological and sociological hypothesis. It may or may not be a very powerful force, but at least for me it has been a daily practice that has been a reminder that this entity might be deserving of concern and has allowed me to kind of reinforce my commitment to thinking about their possible interests. And so I'll offer that for anyone who might be
yeah,
similarly moved by that.
yeah. How do we not have people feel we're insane? I think more than 99% of people think we're insane to be even having this conversation.
Well, I think a lot depends on how you go about having the conversation. In my experience, a lot of people are remarkably open minded to the idea that consciousness and sentience might be much more widespread than we appreciate. And in fact,
Mhm.
there are a lot of people who just do default to the idea that all animals in their own way are conscious and sentient and then are surprised that scientists have taken as long as they have
Mm,
to come
mm,
around to that same
yeah,
appreciation. And when you can have the conversation in a way that respects the evidence, is careful and nuanced about the science, and is careful and nuanced about the ethics and policy, I think that opens up space for greater appreciation. There might be people who are naturally resistant if they sense that opening the door to the conversation at all immediately leads to prohibition for all ways of interacting with these animals. And I think there can be space for raising the questions, for acknowledging the
Mhm.
evidence, for acknowledging the possible ethics and policy implications, but also acknowledging the limits of what we can know and what we can do and how much we can care, and then just having a conversation together
Yeah, yeah,
about how we can gradually build momentum towards better, more humane policies. When we talk about it that way, then I think people feel more willing to acknowledge what's there.
yeah. Amazing. All right. Thank you so much for your time and keep up all your great work.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for the conversation.